honoured to be joined by three very talented guests. Before I ask them to introduce themselves, I would just make clear that we are exploring what impact the digital age has had on jazz. We're looking at social media, we're looking at streaming, and we're looking at online platforms predominantly. And we'll also just be very quickly touching on the ESTA visas that some of the UK jazz artists have come across as well, and what impact social media might have had on that as well. We've got a couple of really good questions for you too. So for the sake of argument, when we talk about jazz, there's quite a interesting debate on what jazz is, how it's changing, whether certain artists that are around right now, genre-breaking artists like Christian, like Jacob, are jazz or not. We're going to try not to get caught up in that, because that could be of its own, which would be fascinating, but not quite about jazz and the digital age. So we're going to just refer to jazz in the widest sense of the word. So if I can just ask the panelists to introduce themselves. Jacob, do you want to kick it off down your end?
Hello everybody, how's it going? Hi, my name is Jacob Collier, and I'm from London, England. I am a musician. I wouldn't say jazz musician necessarily, but I think that some of the things I love about music definitely include jazz. Jazz is the basis of a lot of my understanding. I'm a multi-instrumentalist. I made some YouTube videos, which some people watched, and then I made an album, which some people bought, and then I've ended up here on this panel. But I'm really excited to be here as part of this discussion. It's really great. I'm honoured. I might pass the baton on to the next person.
Cool. Hey guys. My name is Natalie Weiner, and I spent the past 2 years at Billboard, where I was sort of a writer and associate editor at the magazine. I actually just moved to Bleacher Report, so I'm not there currently, but I still am writing about music, and I spent a lot of time writing about jazz specifically. So.
Cool. Hi everyone, my name is Christian Scott Atunde Adjua. I'm a trumpeter and composer, produce records, and I own and operate an app company called Stretch Music. And I'm glad to be here with you guys to see a lot of familiar faces, so this is going to be fun.
And I probably should have done my first, because now it feels like a bit of a come down after these amazing people. My name is Tina Edwards. I founded Jazz Standard, which is a multimedia platform which aims to make jazz a little bit more accessible to new and young audiences. And we're worldwide, but based in London. So just so you know, we are live streaming this on Facebook. You can find that at facebook.com/this is Jazz Standard. And we're inviting people to comment with any questions on that post, or also on Twitter as well with the hashtag Digital Jazz. So I'll be checking tweets as we go along. I want to just quickly start off by looking very briefly at jazz and image in context to our topic. There's two types of people. There's those that like to categorize and those who don't. I think that those who do like to categorize music tend to be, in my opinion, music journalists, the broadcasters, the commentators. Perhaps those that don't are the artists. In that context, we're going to explore jazz categorization very quickly. Jacob, Christian, I'm going to come to you with this. Do you find that jazz categorization is problematic in how you communicate your music?
Well, in how we communicate our music, yes. So we call the music that we make stretch music, which is sort of our reevaluation of everything that has grown out of the jazz context in the last 100 years. So, our music, you could argue on some levels, is inherently jazz, but just because it's inherently that doesn't make it exclusively that. I'm born and raised in New Orleans in the Ninth Ward. I grew up in the Treme area. Most of my teachers were the children of the original practitioners of this music. And they never viewed the traditionalist music in the way that it's seen today, right? I always learned that jazz was a synonym for blues, right? And not blues in the sense of, like music that's like melancholic and woe is me, but blues in the sense that the human beings' most sincere expression of what it is that they're feeling through a musical landscape, right? So they would always say that jazz is just blues that learned to refine itself to exist in all contexts musically. And so this is sort of how I view the music. I think, I've always sort of had a problem with genre, and it's part of the reason that we started to make music that we make, which goes about the business of sort of breaking that idea down. Because for me, as an example, just to kind of take a half step back, like I said, I grew up in New Orleans, I grew up in the Ninth Ward. The elementary school that I went to is William Frantz Elementary School, which is the first desegregated school in the country, right? I could hit it with a rock from my backyard. And so this neighborhood was a white neighborhood, eventually ended up being a black neighborhood once Ruby Bridges desegregated the school. But when I'm growing up, I'm seeing people that are enduring the same things that look different, right, one side of the tracks or another. They may be enduring food insecurity, or they may be being undereducated so they could be a labor class in New Orleans. But seemingly the same people, but because of topical issues like color, they see each other as sort of nemesis and adversarial figures. So I realized that the only space that this didn't exist was when music was around, when the brass bands were playing, or black Indians were in the neighborhood doing their traditional music. And so as a young person, I decided when I started to play music that I wanted to try and create a template musically that went about the business of artistically breaking down this very pejorative notion of race that divides us, right? I think everyone in the room will agree that insofar as it is a social construct, that race exists, right? But there's no Homo sapien Africanus, right? Like, we are all one, right? Obviously, you know, your parentage may, or your ancestors may have taken one route to get where you are, and due to things like geographic isolation, maybe your eyes look a little bit different from mine. That doesn't make you a different species from me, right? So what I wanted to do was to create a musical landscape that addressed that, right? So if I could take the cultural expression from all of these seemingly disparate contexts, right, and marry those things, then what am I saying about the people? So as an example, when someone says to visualize a Western classical musician, and then someone says to visualize a trap lord or a hip hop musician, you see very different people, right? So part of that is we don't think about the fact that the way that music is disseminated to us is hyper-racialized. And so I wanted to create a template that went about the business of breaking that down. And obviously, per my pedigree and my background, doing that through sort of a jazz template made the most sense, because this music makes it its business to acculturate other vernacular into its space. So that's how I feel about it.
That's a really interesting point. Jacob, you said that when we were kind of just chatting before the panel, that people are stuck in a notion of what jazz was as opposed to what jazz is. Talk me through that a little bit more, and in the context of digital media and social media.
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess to give a small background to how I got into jazz, I was brought up in a family of musicians where everybody sort of sang and everybody played at all times. So it was like a kind of second language to me. Kind of, I was learning to speak at the same time as I was learning to sing, I guess. And so I really fell in love with the idea that music could be very emotional at a young age, specifically in terms of harmony, because it's such a joy to me to sit and take to take something musical that exists and to reinvent that in terms of something different harmonically or something different rhythmically. And I guess in my mid-teens I realised that my crushes that I had formed on harmony and groove and improvisation were perfectly married in something called jazz. And this was very exciting to me, because I guess I found the epicenter of what I've been looking for a few years, but in perhaps 10 years of just playing different chords on the piano and singing different things and playing around. And it was a massive exploration. I never set out on any particular quest other than to quest. And jazz felt like the answer when I was in my, I guess about 15 or 16. I really began to think about this music as something, the largest umbrella that I had discovered up until that point of a place where all sorts of different kinds of music can come together and exist. I studied jazz for a couple of years, and it felt as though everybody was looking back towards the sort of golden age in some ways of where this music come from. I'd say there are a few different phases of jazz which are very important, but one that I was very much encouraged to imitate and to discover more about was Miles Davis in the 1960s and his quintet, and the way that felt, and the way that they interacted with each other, and the way that they reorganized and reinvented these songs that people already knew and loved. And I feel like if you look at jazz today in 2017, it's such a fascinating horizon, I suppose, because we have such a rich tradition of things that have come before us in terms of musical minds, people who have stretched things to their absolute limit. Someone like Miles Davis, for example, stretched so many things to its limit, and then sort of left these limits open behind him for other people to continue to grow. And right now, because everything's so available, I think it's just wonderful to think about looking at this music as something we can take a little bit like Miles did and grow. But I guess the question which we'll be discussing a little bit more of is what is it that we're growing? Is it what's come before, or is it what is still to come? And by looking around us and by things which are so available on the internet and things like this, how can we draw together all of this information which in our generation is so readily available, and how can we make sense of this by using our well-renowned techniques of harmony and groove and improvisation?
So much enthusiasm on this panel, I love it. Let's get a journalistic perspective. Natalie, do you billboard, or do you write about jazz differently to how you might write about other genres, whether consciously or not?
I think that's an interesting question, and it's also, I think it depends on the outlet, you know? Like, writing for Billboard is kind of like every kind of music, you know? So you have to assume that most people reading your stuff, like, maybe don't have background in it. So it's, writing about jazz at Billboard was just kind of like, you have to assume you're starting at square one every time. And also, like we're talking about with jazz's image and sort of the ideas that people come to it with, like, you have to assume that people reading your piece, like, come to it with this idea that jazz is Miles Davis, you know? Like, and that is kind of the underlying assumption. They're like, this is what jazz sounds like. It's kind of blue. I looked up, you know, the top jazz album of last year was a Frank Sinatra compilation, you know? And so it's like, that's the sort of baseline. So you're trying to sort of show how that's a misrepresentation without saying you're wrong, because obviously that is jazz, but it's sort of coming at it as trying to, like, broaden horizons, you know, be a little bit educational rather than just, like, reporting the news. I mean, at least that was my sort of impetus as a person writing about jazz, was sort of like, how can I present this in a way that will make people want to know more, you know, encourage curiosity? And I mean, that's always sort of a journalistic impetus, but I think particularly with jazz, because it's something that's close to my heart, and because I think it's something that's so often misrepresented, it's even more important.
Okay. We're going to move on to looking at YouTube and social media in relation to jazz. I'm going to start off with Jacob with this before coming to Christian. Jacob, if you had been born, I mean, you're 22, right?
Yes.
So if you'd been born 5 years earlier, your career would be very different. You, I'm sure you'll explain in better words yourself, but you're essentially discovered on YouTube, signed to Quincy Jones Productions after being spotted on there. Like, talk me through how different you think your career would be, or whether, you know, you might be in this situation without YouTube and social media.
Yeah. So YouTube was invented or came into being when I was about 12 years old. And as I was growing up throughout secondary school, as we say in England, or high school, it was fascinating to see how much of an increase it had in our lives. As young people, as young musicians, you know, we'd go to YouTube to learn, to spend time, to laugh, to share. And for me, it's just extraordinary to think that within this little amount of time, I mean, the last 10 years, it's transformed this much of how we live our lives. As musicians, as autodidacts, as creative people in general, I think it's such an incredible source of so many things. You know, I said learning, but it's, I mean, everything's on there. You can find almost everything on YouTube. And the most glorious thing about it, and the reason I was drawn to it as a young person, is that there aren't really any rules. There aren't. There's no way to do it. It's not that you do this and you fit in, or you do this and you don't fit in. It's just that you do something that you believe in, and that's enough. And I guess for me, I never had a motivation to do anything other than what I believed in, and so it was truly wonderful and very exciting for me when I began to do things that I really believed in. And the more I believed in them, the more they'd do. If that makes any sense. And that's really cool. And that comes down to the fact that YouTube is this massively open playing field, and by being a massive sponge as a kid, just to learning as much as I possibly could about everything I could find, YouTube as a medium was like freedom. I mean, that's quite a big thing to say, but it's, I mean, everyone's on there. Everyone who does things creatively in that kind of internet sharing kind of way is on there. So I never particularly set off as a YouTuber into the world of music, but I ended up doing things I really wanted to do in my time, on my own terms, I could get my microscope out and tune tiny little details and just plot things exactly how I wanted to do them, and there was no rush, there was no record label, no one was saying do it this way. I just had a very magical room in my house, and it was the room where I did a lot of my exploring, and YouTube was a place I could share it. And I originally wanted to share it with friends, and and things like that. And there were a couple of videos that I made to go with things that I'd made which sounded like music, which I have done my whole life. But when I was about 16, it made sense to think about how can I visualize this world, and I enjoyed the process of laying out all of the different things that are going on. And for me, with my music, there are lots of different kinds of layers, and often, there's a bass and guitar and a drums and percussion and voices, and it's just, you just put them all there, and then you can look around and you can watch it again and again, and every time you watch it you can find a little detail that you didn't see before. I love that process of allowing people to walk up to the thing that you make instead of pushing it in their faces. And I think YouTube encouraged that to exist, because you can leave something there that you want to leave, and it can do whatever it wants to do, and it's nice to feel like there's a vague career to be made out of that now. It's crazy, actually. It's really nice.
And it's interesting you're talking about, pushing things, and you're not wanting to push things in people's faces. It's all about sort of finding it organically. Christian, it'd be good to get your perspective, because I know you both have very different entry points into what you do. Jacob, started off on YouTube, and I know your first ever gig, from the success of doing YouTube was sort of like 3,000-4,000 people supporting Herbie Hancock, which is mad, and that's from the following you gathered on social media. Christian, you've been touring since a really young age, and I guess you came into it just before social media was breaking. How have you adapted to it?
Well, yeah, I started going on the road when I was about 13 years old, touring with people like McCoy Tyner, these types of folks, when I was a young teenager. And when I started to make my music on my own, to lead my own band, I was maybe 18, 19 years old. And this was a very different time, right? This is before the download-only platform, before Napster, before all of these things, right? We started, when I was 19, we started a record label at Berkeley. And actually, I probably shouldn't say that, but we would like slide the administration a little something so we could like sell records in front of the school, right? So it's, like a completely different mode of operating, right? This is a time period where the touring, you promoted a gig, you played in front of like a room full of people like this, and if you didn't have it, they wouldn't leave there and spread the word about it. Right? So it wasn't something that like you could edit down and clean up and then create a space for it, and then people could say, okay, that's great, and we're going to disseminate it to other people. Like, no, you actually had to have the shit, right? And so like this is a different thing. There's no value distinction there, but they're different, right? Different mode of operating. So we created our own record label, started our own record label. We were at 19 years old, called Impromptu Records. We sold the record. The record did really well. We ended up being on the cover of Billboard magazine twice that year from a record we made at Berkeley, right? So, but this was us literally on the streets of Boston on Mass Ave in front of Berkeley College of Music with a boombox playing jazz music and selling these records for $5 for people, right? So when this is going on, we could never have, I don't think anyone would have conjectured that there would be a platform like YouTube, which is so amazing, right? Like, obviously this is a tool that we use all the time to promote what we're doing and also to disseminate information about what we're doing and to share things. And so I've fallen in love with it in recent years, but it's funny because when it first happened, there were a lot of musicians that I played with that didn't like it, right? Because there was also a big fear, right? Which was there was also something really strange and safe about playing for a room full of people and that being the end of it, right? And then all of a sudden now you have an environment where every time you play, somebody's got a camera on you, right? And the thing about what we do in this music, I know Jacob can attest to this too because his playing is incredible, but you're taking chances. Like this music is about risk. So, when you're in that space and you're taking those sort of chances, it's always a strange thing for someone to have a camera in your face and document that because you don't know what's going to be from minute to minute, and now the world owns it, right? But my experience with it has been really great. I think ultimately what it has done in terms of an educational vehicle is incredible. I always tell my students, when I was their age, when I was 16, 17 years old, if I wanted to hear Sonny Stitt play, I had to buses to a library and I couldn't take the records home. I had to sit there and listen to that record, right? And it creates different things. Like for me, my generation we're sort of that last, we're like the analog and digital, right? I didn't get a cell phone until I was 21 years old, right? I'm born in 1983, right? So for us, you listen to that Sonny Stitt record, it has a certain type of value, right? Because you know that you can't readily hear that, so you have to pay attention in a different way. To whereas my students now, if they want to hear Sonny Stitt, they can type his name in on YouTube and hear his whole catalog, right? So it means what I found is their processing speed is different, right? The retention isn't quite the same, but the value for the information is not better or worse, but it's very different, right? So in terms of how we communicate musically, how we tell stories is a little different because where they're coming from is a little different, right? These kids have the ability to synthesize John Coltrane, Sonny Stitt, Don Byas, all of these things in a day, whereas when I was a kid, there was no way that you can do that. So as a tool to learn to play this music, to learn the actual tenets of this music, I think it's incredible. So, you know, I'm into it.
That's cool. Natalie, what do you think social media does in terms of the jazz archetype? You've got people like Christian, like Jacob, like Shabaka Hutchings, like Yusef Kamal, who will present a certain image, you know, their own distinctive image, which doesn't really fit with the stereotypical, you know, old school jazz guy in a suit in a smoky bar kind of thing. How do you think that has helped jazz to reach a younger audience?
I mean, I think it definitely helps a lot. I mean, just because like visibility is so important in these sorts of things, but I think honestly there's just like so much room to grow. Like we've just seen like this is the beginning, you know, like because the people who are on social media who are, you know, checking out your app and that kind of thing, like they're young, you know, because those are the people who are good at social media. But I think that it's like if we can really consolidate the kinds of communities that Christian is talking about, the kinds of rooms full of people that go to hear jazz music, if we can really translate that online, like in a real way, like that's going to be huge for the music because there's just no overhead with social media really, or very low overhead, and so you have this easy way to reach your audience, like your target audience. And for jazz, that audience is always going to be small, but if you can consolidate it, that's extremely powerful, and it just makes like making money off your music that much easier. So I think social media is awesome in like presenting examples of jazz musicians who are young and who are cool and who don't just listen to jazz and, you know, who talk about all kinds of stuff and not just like how great John Coltrane was once. Like I think that's obviously valuable, and I think we're really at phase 1 of that process. And like sites like you're developing, like that you have, like that's a great tool. And I feel like if Downbeat and Jazz Times were on that same wavelength, like who knows, anything, like that would be huge. But so it's that process of kind of flipping over. I still feel like we're transitioning into the digital age with jazz because there are so many old people who, you know, want to just keep things the way they've always been, and that's just not possible. So
sure. So I mean, going back to the people that are following people on Instagram, you're talking about the users. What about the actual musicians themselves? Do you think that some jazz musicians will see social media as a kind of a compromise to their artistry in some ways?
I do. I mean, I think like in general, there are certain jazz musicians who just feel any kind of self-promotion is a compromise, you know, because they want to feel like they're just focused on creating, you know, which I completely understand, because you get into being a musician because you want to make music and you have something you want to say, and that's the way that you want to say it. You don't want to go out there and be like, come to my show, buy my record. Like that's why people become publicists. That's not why people become musicians. But in jazz, there's just not that much money to go around, so sometimes you just have to do both. And I feel like both of these guys have taken great initiative and sort of coming up with creative ways to spread their message and to spread their art. But I do think there are jazz musicians I talk to who are reluctant to take that step and who don't want to do that. And exactly, and they think that it's fake, and they think that it's just superficial and not what the music is really about, you know, which is a whole other thing. But at the end of the day, jazz is always going to be kind of on the front edge. It's going to be on the avant-garde edge, and that's sort of, you know, people who make it want to think of themselves that way in an intellectual way, not necessarily in a like self-promotional, here's my Instagram selfie way, you know. Sure. It's kind of, sometimes those worlds can be at odds, but I don't think they necessarily have to be. It's different for every artist, though, I think.
I'm keen to get onto streaming in just a moment, but I know Jacob and Christian, you'll have something to add to that. Can you just give me just a couple of short lines on your thoughts on what Andy said?
I mean, I want to go back to what Christian said, which is this idea of learning by doing is something which will never ever be replaced by any other method of learning. And I think that you were saying about people's attention spans are so minute. I think that people tune into, often it's become a normality for people to tune into a fairly small amount of something. and it's almost like a drug. When you become addicted to intellect or information as opposed to like emotional information, it's really hard to sustain anything in your life, especially a purpose for everything that you know, because things that you know don't really have a purpose unless you have some kind of emotional things attached to them. But as far as learning is concerned, I've always been such an avid sort of self-taught learner type thing, and YouTube has been a place where I've learned how to not take things really that seriously sometimes, because people are weird on the internet, right? It's like things get out of hand really fast. And the great thing about everybody having everyone having an equal voice, which is what it is, the internet, is that people can hide behind their own voice, and it's really weird. It gets really weird, a lot. And so by having grown up in a generation where we learn by watching YouTube videos as a method of learning, I would say that I affirm Christian's point that there is never ever a substitute for being present at an event where something spontaneous is happening, because there's a whole wealth of energy that you cannot receive via the internet, and I think it's a shame when people believe the internet too much. Then again, I think that if we think about the music as living beyond it in its most raw state, which is jazz, in terms of only being spontaneous, only being this kind of wild emotional ride of things just happening, and that's it, that's the end of the story. I think that could potentially be looking inwards instead of looking outwards. And something that Quincy Jones has always said to me is that jazz is like the classical music of pop music in some ways. And to revere it is exceptionally important, but to take it as the be-all and end-all of past, present and future, I would say is potentially risky when you consider ways in which people are living and breathing and learning these days that is changing all the time. And so I think that it's very important to respect the things that have come before and the ways in which we've learned before, and the ways in which things have been done before. But I think that to look out of that as a medium is very important, but never to lose sight of that purity that Christian mentioned about learning and playing in a situation where you're inside the music as opposed to outside, sort of looking at it objectively, I think.
And I'm going to pick up on what you said about learning. I guess social media is a learning tool for the user. We're going to need to move on to streaming, but Christian, perhaps you can sort of tell us about your opinions on how people consume music now. Do you think that they put the same value in music now, now that we have streaming and constant access that we did, say, 20, 30 years ago?
Well, no, I mean, there are a lot of layers to that, right? Because on one hand, you could say they value it more because people are, they're gobbling up all this music, right? But it becomes about how that value is seen by artists to me, right? It doesn't tell me that you value our art if you don't pay for it, right? Because how valuable could it be to you if you're not willing to actually pay for it, right? So, I mean, I think, I have this conversation all the time. I have this app company, Stretch Music, and one of the reasons that we created the app company was because we saw something trending, this is maybe when I was leaving Berkeley, like around 2003, 2004, the writing was on the wall when the Napster thing happened. And a group of friends of mine and I, we started rapping about what was going to need to change to make sure that we could always, get paid for our recorded assets, right? And so we created this template because you have the download only thing, right? And Napster and iTunes comes and knocks everything out of water. People are paying $9.99 for these records, right? And then after that starts dwindling, then the streaming thing happens, right? And for a time it was, you had to get between 1,500 and 2,500 dedicated streams to an album for it to equate to you selling 10 versions of that record, right? I mean, let's just think about that let's say the average. 2,000 people have to listen to my record for me to sell it 10 times, right? So if you take a half step back and you just think about young and developing artists, how do they put themselves in a position where they can gain enough resources just to go on the road if they can't actually monetize the record that they may have spent all of their mom's money to make, or so this becomes problematic, right? So what we did was we created an interactive media player that essentially forces the consumer to into an environment that they can't get anywhere else, that they're ineligible for anywhere else. So by having the ability to customize your listening or your practicing experience, this is something that people are willing to pay for, right? Which on one level it's obviously heartbreaking because you would like for people to just be able to take the art as it is, but on another level it's also kind of cool because now you can do things that you could never do before, right? Right now we're working on VR versions for this thing and catalog stuff for it, so eventually you won't just be able to play it by customizing the channel. Eventually you'll be able to walk on a bandstand with me and have me react to you as you're playing with me as well, right? So the future is here and we're looking for different things, but you know, when I think about the value of this music, you know, I'm kind of thinking about part of the point that you were making before about the practitioners of this music and sort of that cognitive dissonance that exists between them, you know, being great artists and them also realizing that, you know, sometimes you have to promote the things that you do. I think a lot of what doesn't get said in these kinds of contexts, a lot of what doesn't get said in P&L meetings at record labels, profit and loss meetings at record labels, is the fact that that mindset is actually something that's kind of designed by this industry, right? I can't tell you how many times I've been in these meetings and I've heard executives at music labels say things like, oh, well, you know, it's a nice record, but, you know, jazz doesn't sell that many records. Well, it's weird to me when the executive at, you know, one of the larger labels says that, because why the fuck do you have a job if jazz doesn't sell records? No, so here's the thing though. Most of the practitioners of this music, they spend so much time refining this that they're not thinking about the type of acumen that is requisite to be able to hold court with those people as well and say, well, that doesn't make sense. Someone is clearly making this money. Obviously, you wouldn't be making these types of investments if no one was going to make any money, right? So this transition between of the jazz record structure being something that competes in the market on a day-to-day basis to now being essentially catalog labels, to where they say, well, we're going to invest in Jacob's first records, we're going to invest in Christian's first records, and the investment may be okay, right? But compared to a pop record, it's certainly minimal. But we know that this artist is going to be an artist that in 70 years, people are going to say this person is a genius, and then that catalog will be worth 20 times more than it is now, right? So breaking down sort of those systemic things that plague this reality and that also inundate the minds of the practitioners that make them say, oh, fuck, I'm supposed to be broke in New York and be the baddest saxophonist on the planet because that's cool, because that's what this person did, right? John Coltrane, you mentioned earlier, his experience we know is laden with all types of stuff, right? But they had their walk-in to go through the things that they went through as well, right? But when we're talking about what's happening during this generation to these musicians, with the streaming thing, with the downloading thing, with jazz labels turning into catalog labels and people believing the idea that all of the best records from this culture of music have already been played or recorded, breaking all of those things down is part of our work. And this is why panels like this and what we're doing with this technology, what's going on with YouTube, is so important, because it goes about the business of, one, like you're saying, educating people, but also breaking that down in the mind's eye of the artist as well. It is valuable, but we wish you paid for the shit.
Definitely deserves a round of applause. We're going to take a look at the app in just a second. Natty, I want to ask you if you can help me bring it back round to the consumer side of things. I wonder, and I wonder if you agree, that music algorithms have helped to give people a broader taste in music. You might go onto SoundCloud, start listening to Flying Lotus, and then it takes you through to Alice Coltrane and someone else, and half an hour later you're listening to something that you might have never have heard of and you didn't search for either. Do you think music algorithms and places like Bandcamp and Spotify and SoundCloud have helped to broaden people's tastes and maybe introduce them to jazz?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that just like we were talking about, just kind of how much music is available, it's really mind-boggling. Like, I mean, when you look at not just YouTube, but every streaming service, like everybody has something a little bit different. And I think, to me, like I looked up the numbers before I came here. In 2016, 48% of jazz record money came from physical albums. So I think it's interesting to think about how these services are like, I know, it's crazy, it's crazy. It's way more than most other genres. And I think that, like, these streaming services, they just offer such a great platform for music discovery and really lower the barrier to entry, which for a lot of people with jazz is very high, because they think about jazz and they're intimidated. They don't know where to start. well, they know to start with Kind of Blue, but beyond there, they don't really know what to do. But so, you know, if you go to Spotify, it gives you a list of like related artists. If you go to Apple Music, it'll do the same thing, you know, because everybody wants you to consume more music because they make more money that way. So it's like, it's a mutually beneficial. Right. And I mean, the issue of royalties is definitely like a whole other thing.
I'm sorry, I was just saying the key word there is they.
Of course. And I mean, you know, like publishers and all this stuff, it's like, it gets really naughty when you're getting into like the nuances of royalties. But I do think like, my belief is that a jazz audience is a committed audience. You know, people don't get into this music like, they're not like, oh, it's the latest Taylor Swift single, I better go buy it. You know, if they're into it, and they're gonna go buy the album. Like, most jazz fans I know, they're not like, oh, I just listen on Spotify and like, oh, whatever comes up. You know, they're like, oh, I discovered this artist and I love this artist and I'm gonna go see them every time they come to town and I'm gonna buy the album. You know, and I think that's something that jazz has that other genres don't necessarily have, and something that I think that all the things we're talking about, social media and streaming, I think those can just be a boon for it, because especially if there's ways for artists to really just not have to deal with labels, because I think honestly, in 2017, a label is kind of a liability for a jazz musician and not an asset. And so places like Bandcamp, like that just let you put up your stuff and you don't need a label and you can kind of just like control it all on your own, which everybody has the technology to do anyway. Like, that's huge for jazz musicians and a way to just connect with your audience, but also reach new people, you know?
For sure. I'm going to just ask if we're going to do an app demonstration in just a second of Stretch Music, if we can get that hooked up on the phone with the visuals. During that, we haven't got much time left and lots to cover, but I'm keen just, while that's getting set up, Jacob, quickly tell us your thoughts.
It's funny, because I think that the they that you mentioned is something that doesn't really exist anymore, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
People invest in musicians because they want to be in direct contact with them, and with things like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all sorts of things. This is now possible, and you can have a direct relationship with the person that you listen to. And so when I become a fan of Christian's music, I become a fan of Christian's story, in the sense that I want to know what's in his head, and I want to know what's in his fingers, and I want to know what's in his ears, I want to know what he's checking out, I want to know what he was checking out 10 years ago.
I'm glad I'm not the only one that had a dirty mind about that. I want to invest in him as a person. You know what I mean? So the exciting thing is that there's now not a necessary medium where I have to go somewhere to exit the other side and get in touch with him. I can tweet him straight away. I can hit him up on his website. I can buy his app. There are all these ways of essentially discovering things about him, which erases the they, which is kind of what needs to happen. I also think that people want to pay, especially with jazz, like you were saying, people want to pay for the music, and the challenge is, how do they do it in a way, you know, I get emails from people saying, how can I buy your album in the way that gets you the most money? Yeah. And that's really hopeful to hear. That's great. And I think it just takes a couple of innovative people, and people who aren't afraid of the music industry and aren't afraid of somehow decrystallizing jazz in the sense that, you know, what happens if it departs from its initial point of birth? You know, what happens if we lose touch with the thing? I feel like nowadays it's a broader platform, because there are ways to make money if you use your imagination. I funded my entire album, which was entirely self-recorded, self-written and arranged and produced, and everything was done on my own in one room in my family home in London. And the whole thing was funded by a website called Patreon. I don't know if you guys know about this, but it's like a Kickstarter campaign, but it's like a tipping service as opposed to one big amount of money. It's lots of small amounts of money. So, as someone who generates regular content on YouTube, for every piece of content I upload, you can offer me like a $5 or £5 tip. And quid, yeah. Quid means pounds. And this is cool, because it means that you don't have to invest $50 or £50 in one go. You can invest a small amount, and then I can give you little rewards in return. And just to make this quick, there was one reward. I think it was like $100 per piece of content. And then if you pay that, then I can harmonize a little melody that you send me. And I received a bunch of like 15-second melodies, which I then put little Jacob faces around, as is my way, and harmonized and uploaded to all of my social media, which in turn got people really excited about the whole of jazz, because it's like, well, hold on a second, he just sang a folk song.
and then there's jazz harmony around it, but I like it. So this isn't cryptic or dirty or in the distance or pure. This is just something that I enjoy seeing. And for me, it was the best thing in the world because I love harmonizing so much. So I would get all these different melodies, all sorts of things, folk stuff, like weird rock, like ex-rock stars would send stuff in, like children. There was this 80-year-old guy, there was a 3-year-old girl. People, just all sorts of people from all over the world funded my album by sending me little melodies, and then I harmonized them all. And I received over 100 melodies, and every penny of that went straight to the record. And that's so exciting because I could look at myself and think, well, what do I love to do the most? I love to harmonize. What can I do the best? Well, I can harmonize quickly, and I'm equipped to do it with very few resources. So let's do it. And it worked. And that's really exciting. And that's a reason why we shouldn't be afraid of looking at new mediums as to ways in which jazz as a medium can be flexible.
Bloody well said. We've got a lot to cover in the next 15 minutes, so I'm going to ask, there's so much enthusiasm on this panel, it's great. I'm going to ask Christian if you can talk us through your app, and is it just jazz fans that you think get attracted to it, or is it a wider audience? Do you think it pulls in people that haven't listened to jazz before, or is it just a case of, fuck it, it doesn't matter about genre at all?
There are people that hate my music that have this thing. I mean, listen, people are on it. I think it's because of what it does, right? Obviously as an educational tool, once I play it, everyone will get it. But having the ability to do what this thing does opens it up to folks that are not necessarily jazz audiophiles, Mm-hmm. If you like music, if you like playing with music, if you want to basically mix a record in your spare time and want to hear what that sounds like, you can do that with this in a way that you could never do it before, right? So I'm going to demo this thing. Can we turn the volume up on it? All right, so the Stretch Music app, before I start to play, I'm just going to give a brief, some bullet points on it. So this app is the first interactive media player of its kind, right? It allows you to customize your listening or practicing experience through using the stems and editing the stems of the recording, right? So I'm gonna play one song for you. Let's see if we can get that one up. Okay, can we turn it up just a little bit more? All right, so let's say you play piano, right? You want to learn the piano part or play the piano without any of the instruments there, then you can just solo that instrument, right? So this is applicable to all of the instruments. So anything that you see red is active, right? So let's take that off. All right, so let's say I want to solo this drum and the piano. You just hear that, right? Or I want to mute instruments. I can use the faders to mute instruments. So to take that drum down, I can use that thing. Or I can use these other to solo, or mute those guys like that, right? So you have everything else there. It also comes with the ability to move any instrument from left to right, so you have panning. It comes with the charts for all of the instruments, each individual instrument. There's a looping function, so let's bring these other guys back. So there's a looping function, so let's say I want to play this phrase starting here. We'll just give it a bar and then it'll circle back. So you can loop as long as you want, as short as you want, and then it also comes with tempo controller. So let's say you can't really play my tempo, I can slow it down. Or I can speed it up. Right? If you're really good, then you can play like that tempo. I can't, but you can. So, as you can see, you can do a myriad of things with this guy, right? So what we're doing is we're creating the ability to, So right now, Stretch Music, the 1.0 version of this thing has the Stretch Music recording on it. But we just created a partnership with a company called Spectrum. So Stretch Music and Spectrum is now offering white label versions of this technology to any artist. Right? So if you're an artist and you want to have the ability to be able to do this with your music and to disseminate your music to people in this space, now you can do so, right? You can find all of that information on our website, christianscott.tv. But this is, for me, this is what the future looks and sounds like, right? We're obviously building the ability to make a catalog so that you can put more content in the white label versions that we're doing, and then we also talked about the VR piece in the future, so the future's here.
That's cool. And thank you so much for the demo. Yeah, round of applause, for sure. And it's amazing to see how engaged musicians are in digital media as well. Musicians are entrepreneurial now. We've added something to this panel which is very topical. We don't have long to talk about it, so I want to make sure we have time for a question at the end. We've got quite a few hundred people watching online as well, so I'm going to try and figure out the best question from the audience or from here. As some of you may have been following, there's been a lot of ESTA issues this year, and this could be a whole panel of its own. But it's interesting to consider with bands like Yusuf Kamal and United Vibrations, who are no longer playing the Jazz Showcase here due to their ESTA being revoked at the 11th hour. You know, that it could be explored that ESTA's asked for social media links, that, you know, maybe there was concerns around, you know, unfounded concerns around the band's names, those kinds of things. Do you think that social media has a negative connotation sometimes with artists having a freedom of speech? Just, you know, just to get your reactions in short to the issues and how the digital age has impacted on these jazz musicians not being able to showcase the amazing scene in the UK. Jacob, we'll start with you.
Yeah,
UK.
yeah. There's that funny thin line between sort of activist and personality, I suppose. And sometimes I can think of some specific people who have voiced political opinions, which are all valid, but it's just too much. It's too much of it. And actually, I want to, by following this person, I'd rather have some fresh air from the sort of dreadful political climate of things. And so I always think it's an interesting line to tread. And in some ways, by making music and leaving it there for you to take what you need to mean, that's the best thing you can do. In these kinds of situations, however, it's that glorious power that social media has, or which human beings have, which social media brings out, which is the coming together of people for reasons such as unity against things which aren't fair, and things which aren't founded, and things which are very prejudiced, and things like this. And I would always say that it's a positive thing. There's obviously been lots of discussion about the idea of living in bubbles, and when one is only surrounded by one's own voice or people with a similar voice to one, it's hard to see outside of that. And it's, you know, I've definitely been I've been as guilty as any other, really, of existing inside my own head with all of the gatherings of people which have spontaneously occurred, things that have begun trending, which have risen to the top of people's attention spans and then made headlines and things just because people are voicing opinions. So it's a very extraordinary world, I think, and when people use it in the right way and are willing to, as I said earlier on, look at the internet but not take it too seriously. It's as massive a tool as any other way of learning. You know, learning about what people are up to, what people are doing, how people are feeling, and what to do about it. And
I should make extremely clear as well, by bringing this up, Yusuf Kamal and United Vibrations have not posted anything politically charged. It's just the wonder around as to why their ESTAs were revoked at the last moment. We don't have much time left, but Natalie, from a journalistic perspective, have you got anything to add to that?
About the visas, or just?
Yeah, just I guess about how the digital age might have impacted the fact that, you know, ESTA applications for artists are now, to be fair, it's optional, but they ask for your social media links now and where you're from, and it makes me wonder, well, does that mean that musicians
should
need to double think? Yeah, censor themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's always a difficult question, and I think sort of trying to figure out the whims of the government is like never, especially now, not going to be easy. So, I mean, I personally would err on the side of saying whatever you want and whatever you feel compelled to say. But yeah, I mean, I don't have any insight really into sort of the direction in which immigration policy is going, but it's certainly alarming. But yeah.
For sure. Okay, well,
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, please do, yes.
You know, obviously you're going to take your lumps when you get your lumps. Some people don't see it, you know, as in this gray area. You know, a lot of people endure an experience where they feel compelled to speak because it's life or death if they don't, right? Like I said, I grew up in the Ninth Ward in New Orleans, where your body could be taken away from you pretty much for anything, right? And obviously, like, my name is Christian Scott Atunde Adjo. I'm a person that de-westernized my name and everything that came with that, right? So, you know, depending on when I'm traveling or where I'm going, I could go through that just based on people looking at my name, what I call myself, right? So I don't think you know, it makes sense on any level to censor yourself for that reason. If they're going to stop you from coming in to do it, find another means to say what it is that you need to say and do what it is that you need to do. Like, you know, drawing the line in the sand because they don't let you in one place or another for this time. You know, this is not the first era where people were denied access to some place. And just like we're saying, we live in this era now where you do a live concert from your bedroom and still disseminate whatever it is that you want to say to people. So, you know, I don't come from a situation where I have the luxury of like choosing not to speak.
Well said. It's a shame to have to wrap it up so quickly there, but I'd love to just see if anyone has any questions in the audience here, which will probably need a fairly short answer, unfortunately. But does anybody have anything that they'd like to ask any of our panelists about jazz and social media, jazz and YouTube? Please go ahead.
So one of the things that I've noticed is that when I was younger, I used to spend a lot more time with music. Sometimes it'd be more difficult music, and I would get a lot of reward from that. And now with things like Spotify, with all of these streaming services, I spend a lot of time with a lot of varied types of music, but I don't sit down, and I think you were mentioning this, a little bit of this earlier, but how has that affected your artistic practice, looking at those things and knowing that people might not spend hours and hours with your thing or with your music, but they might only be spending 2 or 3 minutes with it?
So you're asking how music streaming and shorter attention spans in a way because of more choices affects musicians' artistry in a way. Okay, cool.
I think you just, you know, you try to make what you're making as dope as possible up front, you know, if I'm being honest, right? You know, as a musician, sometimes there are moments where, you know, I'm vetting out my curiosity and say, you know what, this song is going to be 15 minutes. You don't like it, sorry. It's you know, it's like a plate of food. Like, you know, I might make you a plate and it might have like asparagus and beets on it, and I know that that has a nutritional value, but you might not give a shit, right? You don't have to eat it, right? Right, you don't have to eat it. But for me, you know, I've subscribe to this idea that, you know, I think music should be dope. I don't know, just me. So I try and make the music as dope as possible in every moment, so there's at least something that holds you or captivates you or touches you, right? And if I can do that, then you'll probably be more likely to investigate other songs that might be 10-minute exposés, you know. You get it.
And very quickly, Jacob, let's get your ideas.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, to change what you want to do to fit the needs of other people, I've always had the opinion. I've always been of the opinion that that's a rather ill philosophy. I've always listened to albums all the way through. I listen whenever I travel. I listen to something from start to finish. I love the 15-minute opuses. I love all of that stuff. And if we as the musicians stop making those, who's going to be doing that? And I mean, there's never a reason I think to bow to the needs of somebody else, and it might feel like a selfish thing to be doing, to think, well, I'm going to make music for myself only, but that's far less selfish, I think, than making music that the other person will like and not what is connected to you, because that's way less sustainable. And so if you're actually looking at the value of what you're making something way more valuable if you make something for yourself, I think.
And Natalie?
I mean, they're obviously the experts, but I think the reason that we listen to this music is because, you know, we're looking for genuine artistic expression, and that's going to manifest however it's going to manifest. I mean, but that's, you know, if you want to listen to pop music, you'll listen to pop music, and you want to listen to a pop song. But if I'm sitting down and I'm seeking out a jazz album that maybe like 500 people bought, you know, I'm going to sit there and listen to it no matter what it sounds like.
Got nutritional value for sure. I want to say a massive thank you. I love that phrase. I'm fucking right. I want to say a massive thank you to our panelists. Before I ask you to give a round of applause, I just want to shout out to say that if you haven't had your jazz fix, there is a UK Jazz Showcase this evening with Go-Go Penguin, Sarathi Kaur, a native dancer. We've also got Moses Boyd, Exodus, Shabaka Hutchings is sitting in. I know, right? Shabaka Hutchings is now doing a set sitting in for Yusuf Kamal and United Vibrations, and there's going to be a solidarity jam. It's going to be quite something. So that's at the main 2 from 8 p.m. right through. And yeah, it's going to be really, really sick. So do come on down. There's going to be more about this. We're going to embed the stream as well on our website. This is jazzstandard.com. If you've enjoyed today, we've had loads of tweets coming through. Just tweet us jazz_standard. You can hashtag digital jazz. This is jazzstandard.com is the website as well. And we're going to have a documentary with our panelists and the founder of Bandcamp and lots of other really interesting people giving their commentary on this coming out over the next few weeks. I think that's about it. I've been fascinated by this, and I want to thank Jacob, Natalie, Christian. Jacob, you had a real issue getting here from snowy areas.
Yeah, I just
and
made
Natalie,
it. I was lucky to be here.
yeah, it's been really lucky. So all of you guys have been absolutely amazing, and love what all of you do. So please help me in joining for a big round of applause.